Okay, I'll bite. You probably have seen it 1,000 times on television and across the internet. I have seen it 1,000 times just in the comments section of my own channel. Trump started an air war against Iran to distract the American public from the Epstein files, just as he conducted the special Maduro operation 2 months ago, and just as his administration will soon turn its sights to Cuba or elsewhere. Let me just save everyone some time and spoil the two primary messages of this video. 1. Political insiders do not believe that the full files will be as damaging as the prevailing online sentiment believes that they will be. And 2. The fact that conventional insider wisdom is skepticism actually creates the incentives for war to occur under some conditions. And if the common internet perception about the file was true, we would not be observing a war. Gotta appreciate the irony there. And yeah, there will be lines today to illustrate the argument. Actually, let's go straight to those as well. Only a couple of days ago, we explored the bargaining problem that arises if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons in the future, or citizen willingness to flood the streets to protest the regime fluctuates over time. I intentionally moved past the possibility of Iran being an Epstein-inspired distraction, so that we could instead focus on the main concerns arising from the boring old bureaucratic thinking within the Pentagon. But while you may know me as the lines guy, crisis bargaining theory in international relations is more than 3 decades old. Academically speaking, I am late to the party. One of my old friends watched that video and sent me a message, suggesting to me that the problem is less the value of a distraction, and more of how none of us know the actual value of the distraction. So here I am today to walk us through that argument. Okay, we start with the same basic premises as always. Humor me with territory for a second, even though the substantive issue is broader policy influence in the region. And imagine that the United States wants to draw a border as far east as possible, while Iran would prefer a border as far west as possible. If you can pinpoint what the expected outcome of the war will be, and note that Iran will lose some value of the overall prize due to the costs of war, and the same is true for the United States, then a range of mutually acceptable settlements arise. They radiate from the expected outcome of the war because they roughly mimic what a war would do, but no one has to suffer the costs of that process. Unfortunately, this logic is predicated on leaders internalizing the costs of war and not believing that fighting will create a private benefit. I know, that is a lot to ask from our elected officials. Well, this plays right into the common argument regarding the Epstein files. There are details inside the files that will be politically damaging to Trump. Thus, Trump needs to keep both Congress and the media fixated on something else, lest they spend time investigating and revealing the hidden information. Something like a war, even an unpopular war, which early polling indicates this one is, would therefore be an overall positive for him. Now, as an explanation for war, the private benefits argument is logically coherent, though with some critical nuance. Specifically, you do not inherently get war even if the leader finds his own benefit to be larger than his costs. Directly applying this argument to the current situation, if you think that Trump barely cares about the loss of life or money spent in Iran, but he does bigly care about creating a distraction, you still do not necessarily have a recipe for war. To see why, let's return to the maps. We draw the US cost line as radiating back toward its least favored outcome. Private benefits drift the now net cost line in the opposite direction. Once it crosses the expected outcome, we have a situation where the leader has more benefits than costs for war. However, as I said, this still does not inherently explain why a war would start. Remember, Iran also pays costs. Thus, for the case drawn here, a bargaining range still exists. In effect, the US leader's private benefits endow the leader with bargaining leverage. Iran must concede more to convince the US leader not to fight. Yes, let's all appreciate the irony here. These premises imply that, at least on the international stage, the US public benefits from any distraction value that Trump has. For the private benefit to cause a war by itself, and thus this time hurting the US public, the private benefits must also exceed the opponent's cost of war. Bear in mind that Iran is getting smoked right now. Its costs of war are large. Heck, I keep using the same old stock footage of the Ayatollah because he is recognizable, but the war has been so costly to him that he is no longer a resident of Earth. As a result, we have an explanation that could be theoretically valid, but lacks empirical grounding. As I said at the top, I know that the modal internet sentiment is that the full Epstein files would be game over for Trump, but I cannot stress this enough. That is not how political insiders both in Washington and foreign capitals feel about the situation. Yes, you hear a ton of discussion on Capitol Hill about how devastating it will be, but that is because it generates good political points, and the prevailing online sentiment just shows how effective the narrative has been. But the notion that Epstein kept detailed notes on a criminal conspiracy is dubious, as my recently deceased friend Stringer Bell once told me. There is also the problem that the Biden administration oversaw the file for 4 years, and somehow no one considered releasing damning information about his chief political rival. And if you think that Biden is somehow implicated as well, note further that Harris was ultimately the 2024 candidate, and still no one bothered to sink Trump on her behalf. It defies logic to believe that no one in Washington would even leak it, bearing in mind that Washington is a notoriously leaky place, unless the prospective damage to Trump is not all that damaging. Consequently, the prevailing insider sentiment is that the files contain information that Trump would prefer not to become public, but it is nothing that would result in him being impeached or arrested. So, we ought to pull back the distraction value of the Iran war. Perhaps some distraction value remains, but it is not large. A bargaining range therefore still exists, and we need to consult other bargaining frictions if we want to explain the war. Well, let's stick with the files for a second. There is a massive information asymmetry at play here. Trump actually knows what he has done, and he knows much better than we do what is in the files. And by we, I mean you, I mean me, and most importantly, I mean Iran. A couple of weeks ago, when the Ayatollah was still relaying messages to everyone's second favorite New York real estate developer, the bargaining game that Iran was playing was to guess the location of this line. That is, what the United States' expected outcome of war is, minus its costs, plus Trump's private benefits. Remember, the bargaining range is a range, and some of those outcomes are better for a particular party than others. This line is definitionally the minimum that Trump is willing to accept. It is consequently the best feasible deal from Iran's perspective. The problem in practice is that calculating that bottom line requires knowing the balance of military power between the parties, how costly war is, and how much Trump privately benefits from war. In the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we have discussed at length the problems with trying to divine the distribution of power and the opposing costs of war. Putin had a very distorted view of Russian power, Ukraine had good reason to be cautiously optimistic, and so negotiations went nowhere and the invasion began. Well, for the reasons that I just described, the same type of information problem arises when trying to guess Trump's private benefits. For the sake of simplicity, imagine that power and costs were public information, and that there could only be one of two things in the Epstein files, something just a little damaging and something very damaging. That would generate two possible bottom lines for Trump. One is further west, corresponding to the small private benefit from the files containing a pinprick of damage. The other is further east, corresponding to a file that contains a deep dark secret. Note that if everyone knew what the true situation was, we would not have any problems reaching a negotiated settlement. But Iran is in the dark, and so it finds itself in a tricky situation. In negotiations, it should propose one of those two divisions. But which one? Each comes with its own benefit and drawback. Option 1 is to demand out to that far line. This has the benefit of maximizing Iran's share of the peaceful settlement, conditional on Trump not fearing the Epstein files all that much. The downside risk is that Trump is actually terrified of the files. He therefore rejects the proposal, and Iran suffers its costs of war. Oh, and the US public also suffers from a bargaining failure caused by the files. The alternative is to make a conservative demand out to the closer line. This appeases even the terrified Trump, so of course the less fearful type of Trump also accepts the proposal. The upshot for Iran is that it assuredly sidesteps the disutility of war. The drawback is that if Trump is actually less fearful, then Iran makes an unnecessary concession. What dictates Iran's optimal choice under these conditions is its belief about which type of Trump is more likely, weighed by how costly war is to Iran. If Iran is fairly convinced that Trump has a lot to gain from a distraction, then it will prefer to make a greater concession. That is better than suffering the cost of war a large percentage of the time, given that the implicated type of Trump would reject smaller offers. The critical implication here is that if it is widely believed that Trump has some significant skeletons in the closet, no war occurs. The distraction value simply gets subsumed by the bargaining choices. In turn, if Iranian expectations matched much of the prevailing online beliefs, we would not see a war. On the other hand, if Iran is fairly convinced that Trump only benefits a little from a distraction, then Iran should pump up its demands. Yes, Trump will initiate a war if Iran is wrong, but that is better than leaving all of this additional territory on the table whenever Iran is right. Ah, but did you catch what I just said? The case where war can occur is when the default expectation is that Trump has little to gain from the distraction, and that is exactly the prevailing sentiment among policymakers. To recap, the mechanism for war here is 1. A leader has private information about his personal benefit for war. 2. The opponent's belief is that the private benefit is likely small. And 3. That assessment is wrong. Taken together, the first two of these conditions fit what is publicly observable about the situation. The third is something that is inherently unobservable. Now, there is no saying that this mechanism has caused the war in Iran. There are a bunch of reasons why the war may have occurred, and it is hard for us as outsiders to adjudicate which one did the heavy lifting. I will say, though, that the issue with shifting public willingness to protest in Iran is also a logically sensible explanation for the war, and we can more directly evaluate that its conditions hold today. But as a good Bayesian, I ought to be open to the possibility and update my beliefs given that a war has occurred. So, yes, I should nudge my belief that the Epstein files are worse than they seem, but I am not going to update all that much. You know, I have been forced to update my outros quite a bit since this new war began. But let's pivot back to a classic one as I tell you about these two excellent books about the original war. The one on the right includes a deep dive into both asymmetric information and private benefits as a cause of conflict, so it is a good choice if you like the general themes from today. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.